Hello everyone, my name is Matt Barwat, an academic researcher, educator, and activist. Today I have the great pleasure of inviting Bandy Lee, who is a world-renowned forensic psychiatrist, a violence prevention specialist, who for several years now has led the World Mental Health Coalition, which is a group of mental health experts who formed together to warn of the dangers posed by Donald Trump to America, United States, and the wider world. I've invited Bandy to take part in this interview to discuss one key part of her work for which she's less well known, which is the principal author of the first ever Declaration of Freedom of Mind in history. Bandy, welcome to the podcast interview. When and how did you first become familiar with the concept of freedom of mind?
Yes, first of all, thank you for having me and for doing a podcast on this critical issue. I wouldn't say that I had a academic introduction to the topic. It was really on the grounds as I was working as a psychiatrist. It was remarkable to me how patients would describe the emancipation they felt once they were out of their episode of illness. And oftentimes I would have sent them kicking and screaming to a forced hospitalization where they would be forcibly medicated. And yet, during those times, I would feel that my rapport with the patient is now forever gone because I had done such awful things to them against their will.
Mm,
But the most surprising thing is that they would return to thank me. They would be very grateful that I did what I did. And the mental oppression that they were under during that bout of illness seemed to far outweigh any kind of anything that I had done, or they would often go into the ambulance, and they were probably, since being in my office, continued to be subject to a lot of restraints and forced treatment.
mm,
During the bout of illness, they would double down, insist that whatever they were saying is what they wished to, uh, what they desired, and not consider any help or treatment from their condition.
mm,
Uh, but once they were released from that mental oppression, it seemed that the peace and the freedom they felt was so great that they were willing to let go of any of the cherished ideas they clung to vigorously before.
mm.
So that was my introduction in a very clinical treatment
Oh,
setting.
okay. And these were patients suffering from mental illness or suffering from a situational environment such as a criminal gang or a cult.
These were initially they were from those suffering from straightforward mental illness. I worked in state hospitals where patients would get pretty ill, or in state clinics. And then I moved on to a career working in prisons where I would encounter the same situation from former gang members. In fact, being a part of gangs is almost like being a part of a cult
Mm,
where their own thinking and their mind is, in a sense, hijacked in order to meet the needs of the leader and to align themselves in a very conformative way
mm,
in order to espouse a new doctrine or set of rules or a way of being that defies the mainstream world.
mm. And as you pursued your career in psychiatry, was the phrase freedom of mind, was that something in the lexicon at the time, or did that emerge later into your memory?
Actually, it didn't come up very much in psychiatric settings,
Okay.
um, and it's seldom explicitly discussed. But
Okay.
I find it to be the goal of all treatment,
Mm,
that ultimately the goal of treatment is to enhance a person's mental health, agency, and freedom, and ability to choose in ways that would support whatever avenue of life they chose.
mm,
Uh, that's why the practice of psychiatry or mental health has no political affiliation or no ideological leanings. Um, yes, they say we lean to the left, but I didn't find that particularly so, especially in psychiatry. But
mm,
nevertheless, our aim is always the same, to help the patient, the human being, achieve their own potential, which
mhm.
includes freedom of mind.
Yeah. As you know, I've done a deep dive on the history of freedom of mind, how it appears in the literature. And in Buddhist and other more spiritual writings, freedom of mind is described as an inner peace, freedom for the raw and uncontrolled processes of the mind. As I like to say, kind of freedom from the mind itself. Is that a description you would subscribe to? And does it overlap with the psychiatric definition or understanding of freedom of mind?
Well, I personally would say it overlaps because the situations I described, where one is experiencing mental oppression or even uh, subjugation to this mental pathology, um, that's an extreme situation, but
Mm,
I think we all carry that condition to a certain degree. And the only way to be free of it is to find spaces in our mind where we can free ourselves from the world's conditioning.
mm,
The world is very wounded.
mm,
I think most psychiatrists would agree with that.
mm,
Um, but it also is a barrier to our recognizing the true freedom we have,
mhm,
uh, and the freeing quality of reality. So, in order to perceive that reality without the fetters of our conditioning and worldly um, messages of what is and what ought to be, then we can attain a greater state of freedom.
mm.
And that happens in Buddhist practice through meditation.
Yeah.
In other religions, it may happen through prayer and confession.
Mm,
Uh, I think the ultimate goal of all spiritual traditions is to try to obtain that greater state of not
mm.
only emotional health, but spiritual health.
In my research on the history of freedom of mind, the oldest literary reference I found was at the end of the 16th century, and this was followed by a massive increase in usage at the time of the Enlightenment and the French and American revolutions, and also the anti-colonial independence struggles that followed. Can you talk about your study of history, in particular the Enlightenment, and the origin of thoughts that led to the French and American revolutions, and how it helped inform your work and current approach?
Yes, freedom of mind is very much a part of Enlightenment philosophy, or at least it's embedded in the concepts. And I think you're referring to my studies before medical school, where I
Mm,
studied Enlightenment philosophy, especially Scottish and French literature, and was very inspired by Enlightenment ideals because it pointed to a greater state of societal mental health. Of course, I didn't call it that at the time.
Mm.
But there is a great deal of there was a great deal of freeing of the mind, educating oneself, and becoming self-reliant so
Mm.
as to be able to govern themselves. And it was a great revolution in thought.
So, in the French literature, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's quoted as saying to the effect that l'esprit humain, the human spirit, is free, but corporal humans are in chains. Does this reflect a presumption of the Enlightenment that the mind is free and that now the body needed to be free? And in retrospect, how do you consider this presumption? Can we say that it's faulty in ex post facto?
Well, Jean-Jacques Rousseau may be said to be the first anthropologist, in
Mm.
that he was the first person to reflect on studying human beings.
Mm.
So I think they were just awakening to their own mental freedom.
Mm.
So I wouldn't say it's so much a defect, but they were awakening to this mental freedom that they were recognizing that they had, and that they thought that the physical freedom should come as a consequence.
Mm.
That since they had mental freedom, they were also entitled to physical freedom. What I think they had not encountered at that time, because they were still in the Ancien Régime,
Mm.
which was monarchical and dictatorial.
Yeah.
They had not yet experienced the mental slavery that would be used as a weapon against those who are nominally free. So, in other words, they hadn't yet conceived of a situation where you could be physically free, but mentally enslaved.
Intrinsic to protecting freedom of the mind is understanding what is mental slavery. So anti-colonial activists such as Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, they all underscored that true slavery starts with the mind, and mental slavery features very strongly in the declaration that you helped to author. In your work in psychiatry and violence prevention, how did you encounter the phenomenon of mental slavery?
Well, I encountered it especially among violent offenders
Mm.
because they were my main population of patients whom I treated.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they were quite mentally afflicted, but it did not occur to them that, well, they often believed that they were leading uh,
Mm.
intelligent and clever lives,
Yeah.
that they were gaining um, status and power above others.
Mm.
And they did not see how they were giving up um, greater their greater potential, let alone the fact that they would end up in prison for long periods of
Mm.
time, if not the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they would do so in the spur of the moment to prove their dignity, their own pride of fighting for their uh, basically fighting to the death somebody who disrespected them.
Mm.
And they were willing to do that because uh, they had this notion that that kind of thinking was serving them,
Yeah.
and also they would um, cheat, lie, and do bad things to other people, believing that they were winning,
Mm.
uh, despite the fact that they often ended up poor
Yeah.
and convicted and again incarcerated. So I found that they were often victims of their own mental enslavement,
Mm.
and it often did not occur on their own, but was induced by a larger culture they were a part of, but often um, gangs and cliques where the leader is inculcating in them this way of thinking so that they would worship the leader and follow the
Mm.
leader as well as do their bidding.
Yeah. So in other words, they believed they had an internal, not an external locus of control, despite the contrary situation.
Yes, and even
Mm.
younger people who would join gangs thought that they were coming into something that was wonderful, a place where they could be affirmed, where they would have a family,
Opportunity. Yeah.
opportunity, um, potential for advancement because they were doing so poorly in the outside world. You come into a world where the rules are reversed, and you
Mm.
have the chance to you come on top rather than at the
Mm.
bottom.
Yeah.
But then they are led to doing things that lead them to trouble and
Mm.
cannot pull themselves out of. And still they have to continue to convince themselves that they have made the right choice because the alternative is too devastating. Oftentimes I've treated gang members who had to kill police officers in order to be initiated into the gang,
Yeah.
or kill another poor homeless person, for example.
Mm.
So the guilt of that and feeling that they would be vulnerable to being held accountable for these actions if they left the group, if they didn't have other people to watch over them,
Yeah.
um,
Mm.
prevents them from freeing themselves from that mentality.
Yeah. So if there are any former cult members watching this, the parallels between what they experienced and what Bandy is describing will be quite striking. The parallels between gangs and cults. Um, Today, freedom of mind is associated most with the anti-cult world, in particular the work of cult exit counselor Stephen Hassan, who actually is the person who I learned the term freedom of mind from originally. He's authored a book of that title, and he now runs the Freedom of Mind Resource Center, which works to protect people against authoritarian cults, and also intervene in family and situations of loved ones. How did your work come to dovetail with Stephen Hassan, and what have been the main lessons learned from the rise of authoritarian cults over the last few decades?
I think just for the reasons you described.
Mm.
Um, the Trump era, which became a vast authoritarian cult following, is very much like any other cult or gang, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Um, it's it's through mental manipulation. There's a
Mm.
reason that anti-apartheid activist Stephen Biko said that the mind is tyranny's battleground.
Mm.
Um, it's their battleground for power.
Mm.
Um, and in order for a dangerous, unfit individual to rise to power, he had to manipulate people's minds.
Mm. As the threats to the mind have grown over the past few decades, our scientific understanding of what happens to someone whose mind is compromised in a process of mind control have grown. There's been the study by Robert J. Lifton of the Nazi doctors. There have been work by Steve Hassan and others in the anti-cult field on the cult self, the pseudo-personality, pseudo-identity. Do you have a preferred framing for how someone's freedom of mind is compromised in these high control authoritarian environments, be it a cult, a gang, or whatever?
I would say, well, I consider it in terms of usurpation of
Mm.
personality and agency in order to turn human beings into tools,
Yeah.
instruments to the cult leaders' desires. I might mention that perhaps your audience is unaware that I first started speaking up against Donald Trump as soon as he was elected, and soon after inauguration, I convened the conference at Yale School of Medicine on the professional responsibility we had as psychiatrists and psychologists to warn against his dangerous psychology. And that led to our publishing a New York Times bestseller, unprecedented of its kind, I was told, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess the president. Now, when I published this book, I emphasized the fact that the problem of Donald Trump was a public health problem. In other words, I was thinking ahead to the fact that someone of such severe mental impairments and such serious symptoms would spread those symptoms through his powerful position and exposure to the public, and spread symptoms in a way where his followers will carry on his beliefs, especially if they're delusional. They would become paranoid and violence prone as he is, and eventually become tools to be able to carry out his wishes, be it a violent insurrection against the government, or to threaten and intimidate judges and juries to ruling in his direction, to becoming such loyal, fervent followers that entire power structures and institutions would align with him because they see that there's great revenue or great approval to be had by aligning with him, including the media. And so even though the personality cult of Trump is not a literal cult, in that people have not been isolated, they're not separated from their loved ones, you still have the same effect psychologically, because he has immunized people from other sources of information, such as the news. He has bound them more closely to him than their own family members and friends.
Yeah. Personally, I prefer the term the cults of Trump, because it's not one group, it's multiple authoritarian groupings that come together.
That's true.
That's the way I like to look at it. Let me take you forward to 17th of February 2020, President's Day. On that day, the World Mental Health Coalition held a meeting with citizens organizers in New York City, and you released the first Declaration of Freedom of Mind in history. At the time, you noted a public not lacking in resources or will, but gripped with disappointment, demoralization, and despair at a government's unconcern for its citizens. Its failure to grasp a problem of mental health had resulted in its failure of even a political process, impeachment and removal, and the psychological oppression of a populace was proving to be the most pernicious form of oppression of all. Can you take us back to the time of the first impeachment of Donald Trump? What was the activity of the World Mental Health Coalition, and how did it result in producing the Declaration of Freedom of Mind?
Well, I think there was a great deal of discontent on the part of the people. And they were recognizing that their will was being thwarted, not through a legitimate process, but through various psychological tricks that were being done to in order to make the impeachment process unsuccessful. Many attribute that to the Senate at the time, not holding a trial, not hearing any evidence or witnesses, and simply dismissing the case. That may be true, but from my perspective, it was because we had not dealt with a psychological phenomenon that was happening, which I was calling Trump contagion at the time, or in other settings, shared psychosis. In that enough of the population had succumbed to taking on the same symptoms and beliefs as Donald Trump, that they would not be able to see, or that facts or evidence would not even matter. And so while I was sensing a great deal of distress, I called a meeting in Union Square Park in the middle of February in New York City, and quite a few people came, and we discussed how such meetings were occurring in the times of the Revolutionary War, basically the Declaration of Independence and all manner of documents had formed from such spontaneous assemblies. And so I wished to count it as an assembly. I took down what people desired, what people thought of various assessments that we were making as mental health professionals in terms of where the population was, how to deal with this public mental health crisis, in my view. And ultimately, it was obvious to everyone that a large part of the population was not mentally free, and in fact was voting against their own will, subscribing to ideas and facts that don't serve them because they're unreal, and that mental slavery was now an issue because of the spread of symptoms as well as the psychological manipulation that has been done at the national level.
Yeah.
So that's the psychological aspect of what often happens in cults or gangs. And so highlighting that, it seemed that we needed a way to articulate it as well as to formulate solutions. And that's where the Declaration of the Freedom of Mind came from. And I contacted Steve Hassan at that time because, as you know, he's been using the phrase freedom of mind.
Yeah. Could you talk briefly about the dialogue you had with members of Congress regarding the first impeachment and why ultimately it wasn't successful in convincing American government policymakers about the psychological nature of the Trump problem?
Yes, I'm very glad you brought up that point, because in times of authoritarianism, the key action that is taken uniformly, almost all of them in the beginning, is to neutralize truth tellers, the journalists mainly, and then intellectuals. They are either rounded up or somehow otherwise gagged. And so what happened with us, I mentioned where we published The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess the president, which became an unexpected New York Times bestseller, which spoke to the thirst of the public. So the public was aware and hungry for this information. In fact, we had Macmillan as our publisher. They're one of the big five, and yet it took them 5 weeks to catch up with the demand. Finally, they did reprinting after reprinting, not to run out in an hour or two, because it was so instantly sold out. Within 3 months, we were the #1 topic of national conversation, and I was invited by over 50 Congress members in the end. And I was speaking with them. Initially, it was about the 25th Amendment, which would have been an appropriate intervention. That's when a president becomes mentally unable, and when the cabinet and vice president won't act, Congress can form another body that can initiate the process. And Representative Jamie Raskin at the time was leading this charge and intended to include mental health experts in that other body. But they were also discussing impeachment at that time. So if the 25th Amendment were difficult to do, undoable, the impeachment was another avenue for removing a mentally incapacitated president, because it covered high crimes and misdemeanors cover demeanors of someone who's mentally unfit. So at the height of our consulting and speaking in public, in fact, they charged us with continuing to do our education in public, because only if we educated the public medically could they intervene politically. That astonished me, because they were actually relying on us, which is the way it should be, that intervention should be done not for political reasons, but for reasons that are of reality, as assessed by experts and people who are best positioned to evaluate the situation. And so it was very encouraging. In fact, a journalist at the time told us that we had arrived. And in other words, we had set the stage for an intervention to happen. And it was right at that moment that the American Psychiatric Association stepped in with the New York Times and went on an aggressive disinformation campaign, completely defamed us as being unethical, armchair psychiatrists, kind of really aggressive language that I had never seen of a professional association. But it had the effect, along with the New York Times denouncing us, of blacking us out from the media almost completely within 2 or 3 weeks. Up to that point, I was invited by all the major news programs, cable and network. I was interviewing 15 hours a day, every single day. I thought it important enough, an issue for me to drop everything and accept all these interviews. But within a few weeks, they had all dried up. Or if I was invited, I continued to be invited to CNN, to MSNBC. There were at least 70 interviews to which I was invited, and were all canceled at last minute, or were recorded and not aired. 100%, except for one 2 years later. And same with the New York Times. There were reporters continued to reach out to me. It was right after I was on the front page. And there were at least a dozen articles from which only my quotes were deleted. And so one has to wonder if the media were believing it were important enough, and the public was demanding this information. Every time we published an article, it was the #1 read, the most read of that day, that weekend, that week. And yet we were completely barred, in the sense that we don't hear from mental health experts at all anymore. And the public had become acculturated to this condition, a condition that placed them in grave danger, I would say, is responsible for 1.2 preventable American deaths due to COVID-19 mismanagement, that was responsible for the violent insurrection that almost overturned the government and American democracy, the upending of the world order to a point where we're experiencing such geopolitical instability and conflict in ways that would not have occurred without the full presidency of Donald Trump
Mm,
and his second and third candidacy.
yeah.
How did all of this, in my view, could have been prevented?
Yeah. So, in your opinion, absent that intervention from the APA, you believe that the policymakers in the government would have been much more receptive to accepting your advice?
Absolutely,
Okay.
because I sensed no barrier until that time.
Mm,
In fact, I was quite impressed. I thought that the great mental health awareness campaigns that happened, especially during the Obama years, but in the decades preceding,
mm,
actually had an effect because it seemed at that time that the producers, the hosts of high-profile shows, had no barrier to inviting experts, the relevant experts, even in the field of mental health. And in fact, I was impressed and pleasantly surprised. It went from that to complete going back at least 100 years
yeah.
in mental health advancement, in the
Mm,
kind of stigmatization to the point of total blockage of discourse, when all the
mm,
literature shows that to reduce stigma, you have to speak about the issue.
yeah.
Knowledge and discussion are antidotes to stigma, and we've gone back to the state of stigmatization of the entire field itself, where it
Mm,
remains the only field where the experts are not allowed to speak about the area of their expertise.
yeah. So the word that came to my mind was a chilling effect. Is that accurate?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And it
Okay.
continued because not only, well, the APA's Goldwater rule, which is what they advanced as the reason for silencing all mental health experts, even though it only applies to their members. No licensing board adopted it, no other association adopted it. So it only applied to about 6% of their own, of mental health professionals, which are their own members.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they made it seem like it was the law,
Yeah.
if not a universal rule. It's not even supposed to be a rule. And uh, no one has been disciplined for violating it.
Mm,
And they had no jurisdiction over me. I had resigned from the APA
mm,
in 2007 because they were accepting so much funding from pharmaceutical industries. And now it turned out that they did what they did, completely silencing mental health discourse by professionals in order to protect their federal funding. And they
yeah.
did receive windfalls of funding under the Trump administration that enabled them to buy a building in the middle of Washington, D.C. in ways that were unprecedented in their history.
Mm,
So these are the kinds of compromises and collusions that happen during authoritarian times that
mm.
actually facilitate the advancement of authoritarianism.
This is the declaration that we've been discussing. It's the first declaration in history. The preamble to the declaration describes freedom of mind as a right that is derived from the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and of the citizen, which was adopted by the French government following the French Revolution and the overthrow of the monarchy. Can you say a bit about the French Declaration of Rights of Man and how it has informed the freedom of mind?
Yes, you could tell that I modeled it after
Mm,
the Declaration of Rights of Man, um, which was a great inspiration for me and in terms of um, conceptualizing what mental freedom can do. Um, but as you stated, it was assumed at the time that mental freedom was a given,
mm,
and that only physical slavery needed to be prevented. So the language lacks what true freedom from mental slavery requires.
mm,
And of course, there was after that the universal the Declaration of Human Rights
Mhm.
by the United Nations, and which again uh, speaks of all forms of freedom,
Mhm.
and freedom from all forms of slavery, but it does not specify mental slavery, and it
Yeah.
does not either define it or suggest ways of preventing it.
Mm.
And that's why I thought that a declaration just addressing this issue was needed at this time. And so um, I started drafting it and enlisted a number of members from the World Mental Health Coalition to assist with it. And this is what we ended up with,
Mm.
which very surprisingly you picked up and carried on,
Yeah.
is having a life of its own now.
Yeah, so just for the audience, as you probably know, I'm working on promoting freedom, developing and promoting freedom of mind as part of my PhD doctorate proposal. And when I started on this research project, I hadn't heard of Bandy. I had heard of the dangerous case of Donald Trump, but I didn't know the background to it. And I spotted the declaration online after a quick Google search, and I reached out to Bandy, and that was I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Yeah. So yeah, that's the history. So I'm going to go back to the declaration. So Bandy mentioned mental slavery. So as she mentioned, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international treaties that followed it, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, they do prohibit slavery in all its forms, but they don't explicitly define what is all its forms. At no point does it specify mental slavery. So the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, says that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. What the declaration does is upgrade that rights provision, upgrades that protection to explicitly name the problem. Um, so I'm going to go into the next one. So every human right has positive and negative freedoms. It has a freedom to access certain services or engage in activities, and freedom from some type of violation or negative action. And mental slavery is defined as an absence of mental freedom. And mental freedom, in turn, is defined as people having agency over their own minds. In terms of the other freedoms from all the main variants of mind control, such as disinformation, psychological abuse, thought reform, these are all explicitly named and prohibited. And crucially, the declaration upgrades the status of abridging of the speech and press in relation to mental health to an unqualified right. So what that means is that um, there can be no abridging of the speech or the press in relation to mental health in any circumstances. Current international human rights document allow abridging of the speech or the press in some certain emergency situations. So it moves from a qualified right to an unqualified right. So this is another way that the declaration upgrades the existing international human rights system. On the freedom to side, you have freedom for full access and information and the best available knowledge and expertise. Bandy, could you speak briefly about that? Why, in the context of the Trump contagion, was full access to best available knowledge and expertise quite so important?
Well, it describes the phenomenon of how the mind can be usurped.
Mm,
Uh, it would be able to educate the public in ways that would help them to uh, detect the early signs, not to be psychologically manipulated into becoming, uh, to committing themselves so far in that they couldn't pull themselves out any longer.
Mm,
Um, the kinds of sacrifices I mentioned before um, joining gangs, such as killing a police officer or killing a homeless person. And I've seen it also with child soldiers who were
mm,
ordered to kill family members in order to pledge to demonstrate their loyalty to the leaders and the regime.
mm,
And you might say that Donald Trump's followers, to a large extent, have sacrificed their own uh, their own well-being. Some have given their lives following his defiance against COVID-19 measures. Uh, Others, we see them carrying all kinds of paraphernalia to identify themselves as being part of that cult.
mm,
They've expended enormous amounts of their own wealth that they may not have had and their own personal commitment. Many have severed relations with family and friends.
yeah.
So prevention was critical before all this happened. And how do you know how to prevent something that hasn't happened? It's
Mm,
through scholarship, research, and expert knowledge of those who have dealt with this kind of behavior, symptoms, pathology on a daily basis, and have made it their career to detect, prevent, and manage, contain these phenomena.
mm,
Just because it's happening at national scale does not mean that it's something else. It's
mm,
still a phenomenon of mental pathology. I've often said that fascism is
mm,
not a political ideology, but mental pathology in politics. It
mm,
follows the principles of psychiatry,
mhm,
more so than anything else. And to treat it as normal politics, well, we see where it has gotten us.
mm,
He almost won the presidency and very well might even this time around, unless we can deal with it for the issue that it is.
mm, yeah. And by fascism, you mean authoritarianism, is that right?
Yes, I'm
Hmm.
lumping all of these together because for
Yeah.
me it's
Yes.
the psychological impairment that is
Mm,
important, the developmental woundedness,
mm,
not so much what it's called.
yeah. So I spoke just earlier about positive and negative freedoms. The Declaration is a um perfect combination of the two. As you drafted the Declaration, were you conscious of defining freedom of mind in a positive and not just a negative sense? What it is and what it's not versus what it's not.
Well, you will see from parts of it where I speak about having access to information, having access to an environment where the mind can grow,
Mm,
not just assuming that the mind will exist. So that, in my view, is a positive concept
mm,
of freedom of mind.
yeah.
Negative concept in terms of just removal of mental slavery, I think, is where the other declarations were lacking,
Hmm.
um, especially when the individuals themselves do not believe that they are enslaved.
Hmm.
And I think that's a very important notion to be aware of, because what happens at a time of mental slavery is that you are deprived even of the awareness that you are being enslaved.
There are other types of rights phrasing that weren't included in the Declaration, such as mental privacy, mental autonomy to some extent, mental integrity, also psychological violence. Was there a discussion? Do you remember a discussion about which particular rights phrasings to use and which ones didn't make the final draft?
Those things were, of course, considered because of the current situation and the problems that we were uh, just undergoing at the time.
Mm,
I chose not to include them in order to keep it simple.
yeah,
And I felt that, well, I think in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention
yeah,
of disease, tertiary prevention is intervening with individuals who are sick or a society that is sick. Secondary prevention is intervening with those who are at risk of being ill. Primary prevention is intervening at the population level. So I'm appealing to the part of the population that is healthy and
mm,
can work toward greater levels of health. So I wasn't so much thinking in terms of intervening with, for example, the psychological violence that is happening or
mhm,
the mental integrity that might be
yeah,
violated through, for example, through torture or hardship.
mhm.
Um, and mental privacy, I wasn't aware of until you
Oh, okay.
educated me on it.
So for the audience, in 1975, a now retired judge called Garland Burrell, he wrote a journal article called "A Call for an International Human Right to Mental Privacy," drawing attention to violent predations by Soviet psychiatrists, such as forced lobotomies and other types of mind control. And yeah, the framing he used was a human right to mental privacy. One of the issues with mental privacy is that it's kind of defined in the negative sense because it is protecting against some sort of invasion from outside, and therefore it falls more on the negative side of freedoms. Bandy, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Um, yes, perhaps we could create a supplement for the negative freedoms, but I felt that the positive freedoms were
Mm,
important to define,
yeah,
uh, especially because we have no notion to begin with.
yeah,
We,
exactly.
it's not a mere absence of slavery.
Yeah. So whenever I present on freedom of mind, I will always say that a human right or any new concept has to define itself for what it is and not what it's not. Negative identities, I don't believe in that. So we should always define ourselves in the positive sense, what we should want to be, not we're not. Previously, you've discussed your spirituality and religious faith. For you, what does an approach to religion that's in accordance with freedom of mind look like?
Well, I think the goal of religion is freedom.
Mm,
Uh, as I described before, it's freedom from constraints of the world, uh, of one's own mind,
mm,
um, and an embracing of truth, or almost limitless eternal reality. Um, so the fact that the truth makes us free, according to the Christian Bible,
mm,
is something that I um, uh, relate to very well.
mhm.
I have found that, well, I studied religion, divinity studies at the same time as my medical degree,
Yeah.
at the time to humanize my medical education, but it turned out to be an incredible resource for healing, uh,
Mm,
uh, engaging patients and prisoners who are often in dire situations and desperate for that kind of language. But I think ultimately it points to all our yearning as human beings.
Mm,
Of course, religious traditions don't necessarily reflect that. But
mm,
I think ultimately the goal of all religions is to free us from um, from all our chains, the chains
mm,
we create or those that are imposed on us
mm,
to experience our essence and our eternal being, our selfhood, which is very free
yeah,
and can be seen as a heightened state of mental health, because
yeah.
mental health itself is not just the absence of disease.
Mm. There's a saying to the effect that all great ideas become co-opted. With respect to freedom of mind, authoritarian actors will invariably co-opt the terminology of mental freedom in order to use it for slavery, and this has already happened. What can we do to prevent this?
Yes, well, the Orwellian reversal of terms, where
Mm,
uh, freedom freedom is slavery and peace is war, and so on. That is actually psychiatrically very explainable. It's
mm,
called denial,
yeah.
projection, and inversion of reality.
Mm,
So if we see mental health and freedom, uh, and freedom comes with mental health because when we have access to full information and can guard our mental health as well as uh, all its potentials, um, then we will not be drawn into that kind of rhetoric. We will not be misguided or fooled. Um, and having access to mental health expertise is part of it, because
yeah.
if we were truly free,
Mm,
why shouldn't we have access to the the best available knowledge and the treasures of human civilization? It
mm.
is our uh, wealth that we can use to our ends. Um, and so all of that works together.
In your recent book, you write that human beings are essentially astonishingly free. Human freedom applies equally to the people who have agency, as the healthy mind is resilient, resourceful, and creative under almost all circumstances. My question to you is, would we not be in the political situation we're in currently if humans were not somewhat predisposed to surrendering their will and agency to the authoritarian leader of the day, whoever that might be? Do you think there is something in the human spirit that eschews responsibility and the consequences of freedom?
Yes, it's easy to think that too much freedom may not be a good thing,
Mm,
but it's not freedom that is threatening, but the abuse of freedom.
yeah.
And abuses occur when we have mistaken notions of what would benefit ourselves, and if we have a limited definition of who we are. If we think that we are only our individual bodies, then hurting others could be helpful to ourselves, or taking things from others could add to what we have. But if we think of
Mm,
ourselves as much more expansive, that's the eternal, uh, omnipresent idea in a sense,
yeah.
um, then we would not exploit what we have. And thank you for mentioning my book, The Psychology of Trump Contagion, an existential threat to American democracy and all humankind. I was trying to describe Trump contagion that has come to the point of imperiling our entire nation as well as the world as an extreme version of self-destructive pathology.
Yeah.
Now, the opposite end of that is health. And when we have that heightened health where we don't invert ideas, but embrace true ideas such as power, love, peace, oneness. These things are ideas that are often co-opted by those with other intentions. But
Mm,
in fact, if we go back to the original meaning of these words, then we will find that they are all encompassing,
yeah.
and there cannot be exceptions. You cannot, for example, hate another and love yourself. You cannot denigrate others and elevate yourself. Uh, and eventually, we recognize that all are responsible for all.
Mm,
Um, and that's the state to which we could strive for. We're very far from it, which is the reason why I have stated that even those of us who are quote unquote normal and healthy
mm,
still have the same challenges and same limitations as we see in someone who is quite mentally afflicted. And so we can easily draw an analogy where we
mm,
ourselves are our own slaves to our own imprisonment
yeah.
and to our own uh, limiting ideas
Mm,
that keep us bound.
yeah. So you didn't say this in your book, but what I'm hearing right now is none of us are free until all of us are free. Is that how you're thinking?
Yes, or each one of us, if
Mm,
we can be truly free ourselves, will contribute to the freedom of all.
yeah. Bandy, I can't think of a better place to finish. So thank you for taking part in this interview. So yeah.
Thank you for having me.